Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday, September the 20th, 2023. On Monday of this week, had the privilege, the honor of having a very distinguished Harvard University professor of Latin American Studies and Political Science, Steve Levitsky, on the show. He is the co-author of a new book called Tyranny of the Minority. He's also the co-author of the best-selling How Democracies Die. And the way I describe the show, and these are my words, not his, tyranny of an ethnocratic minority. Stephen Levitsky on what an increasingly broken American political system has to learn from the democracies of Brazil and Argentina. This idea of an ethnocratic minority, tyranny of an ethnocratic minority, seemed to me the premise of Levitsky's new book, Tyranny of the Minority. Well, I'm thrilled that Steve's co-author, Daniel Ziblatt, another very distinguished professor of political science from Harvard University, is joining me on the show today. So I got two Harvard people in 3 days. Someone is smiling on me. Daniel, this notion, as I said, you're a scholar of European politics rather than Latin American politics, but my language of describing America now as a tyranny of an ethnocratic minority, is that fair?
That's certainly one of the driving forces of what's happening in the U.S. is this kind of racially polarized party system. I mean, is the way the political scientists would describe it, where you have one party that's highly diverse, kind of rainbow coalition party, the other party overwhelmingly still, even despite some kind of recent trends, overwhelmingly white, and primarily Christian. And so when you have parties that are polarized along racial and ethnic lines, that can be very dangerous, as the history of ethnic conflict around the world shows. So, you know, the interest really is, part of it is driven by, I mean, the forces driving the Republican Party are in some sense driven by this sense of displacement that people perceive with an increasingly diverse and equal society. And that, I think that we make the case, at least, that that's in part what's driving the radicalization of the Republican Party. But at the end of the day, you know, figures like Mitch McConnell, you know, the Speaker of the House, Republican Party leaders are acting out of partisan interest as much as anything else. I mean, they want to stay in office. They want to win elections. That's what politicians do. I mean, that's fine. That's what democracy is all about. But what we find increasingly is that a political party that can't win a majority that represents that group that you've just talked about is finding ways of staying in power when it doesn't win majorities.
Isn't this, though, Daniel, always the nature of American politics? I've been rereading Rick Perlstein's 3-volume history of Reagan and Nixon, Nixon land, Reagan land. And it doesn't seem as though in many ways that much has changed in American politics over the last 40 or 50 years. Everyone's still fighting the culture wars. Race still dominates. The specter of racism still bubbles under the surface. What has changed over the last 50 years?
I think you have a point that there are these continuities, but I also think we have to be alert to the changes that have taken place. So, you know, the Republican Party, beginning really after the New Deal, I won't go back that far, but at least since the Goldwater era in the 1960s, the Republican Party increasingly saw an opportunity, as the Democratic Party embraced civil rights and sought the full inclusion of all Americans into the political system. The Republican Party, factions within the Republican Party, saw an opportunity to become the party defending white segregationist interests in the South. And so the Republican Party had no voice in the South, rarely won elections in the South, and beginning in the 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, began to make inroads and began to make these appeals, the kind of cultural appeals around race, increasingly around abortion and other cultural issues like this, sought out these voters. But the Republican Party remained a coalition. I mean, a figure like Nixon, even a figure like Reagan, but even more so, I would say Nixon, was a kind of candidate who could pull the different strands of the party together. I mean, he kind of would draw upon the Nelson Rockefeller, more liberal wing of the party, some elements of which had actually voted for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, as well as these more reactionary elements. And so Nixon, in a way, held together this coalition. Reagan did as well. I mean, there was a little bit more of the triumph of the right wing of the Republican Party. I mean, it was no accident that when as we recount in the book, when Reagan announced his candidacy, he went to this county fair in the South where that Pearlstein describes really nicely as this kind of symbolic gesture to say, I'm on the side of the states' rights segregationists, the old segregationists. So, but this remained a coalition. I mean, through George Bush Sr., it's a coalition. I mean, where he kind of tried to view himself anyway as from the more moderate wing of the party. By the time you get to Trump, that faction of the party has taken over. So the difference is that whereas in the past, this was a coalitional party, by the time we get to the present day, the kind of the base, the radicalized base, has taken over the party. And so I think that's a significant difference. That is a significant difference.
Do you think you're arguing in the book, Daniel, that the Republican Party is consciously seeking a tyranny of the minority, that it recognizes that it's never going to be a majority party again? Although anytime anyone ever says that, I always suspect that things change very quickly and you never know what's going to happen in politics. But they're actively trying to transform or game the system so it becomes a tyranny of the minority. This is not a book like your previous one and like that previous generation of books that focuses on Trump. Your book focuses on the Republican Party itself, and it mostly sidesteps Donald Trump.
Yeah, so, I wrote a book before all of these called Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracy, which really focused on actually 19th century Britain and Germany and conservative politics and the role of conservatives in reaction to the rise of democracy. And so that book, writing that book, has always alerted me to the importance of conservative parties and conservative parties that comply with democracy or that go along with democracy. I mean, 19th century British Tories were no great fans of democracy in the early days. I mean, a figure that I write about in that earlier book, Lord Salisbury, was really an opponent of democracy, but over the course of the 19th century, acclimatized himself to it, figured out that his party could win. And once they realized they could win sometimes, then democracy wasn't as threatening. And so I think similarly today, the Republican Party is a party that would like to win elections, I mean, all else equal, but has difficulty doing it because of the nature of its base and the nature of the appeals that it makes to hold that base together. And so they seek, as any politician does, they seek out ways of winning. Whether there's a kind of cognitive dissonance in people's minds that, we claim to live in a democracy, but we're actually not winning majorities. I'm not quite sure. I can't really get into the minds of a lot of these leaders, but I think there are some clues. And one of the things, all of this talk about, we live in a republic, not a democracy. That's a way, in a sense, of kind of dealing with the cognitive dissonance of, we thought we believe in democracy, but actually we no longer can win majorities. So we have to come up with these reconstructions of what kind of system we live in that justify the fact that we can't win in majority. So, I don't think any Republican politician is going to say we live in a tyranny of the minority and that's a great thing. I think they will say they live in a republic, but I think their conception of what a republic is often is essentially a system in which majorities don't govern. And, democracy is certainly more than majority rule, but, you need to at least have some majority rule as a prerequisite for democracy. So I think that's in a way how people cope with this contradiction.
There still is, Daniel, a traditional strain of republicanism within the party. Mike Pence today said that China is close to becoming an evil empire, which sounds very traditionally Republican. One often reads these pieces, particularly by pollsters, that suggest that Hispanics and some African Americans are actually relatively friendly to traditional Republican thinking, the Mike Pence view of the world, shall we say. Is it conceivable in the next 15 or 20 years that the Republicans win back 20, 25% of Hispanic or African American voters?
In principle, it should be. I mean, what parties are supposed to do? I mean, one thing I would say, Mike Pence, what is his support in the Republican primary? Like,
About less than 1%,
yeah. So
probably
this,
at most, probably him and his wife.
yeah. So that this, if we call this a traditional Republican stance, it's not finding much traction.
Although it is getting headlines
Yes,
on
right.
Reuters for better or worse.
Yeah. But to your question about could the Republican Party change? I mean, I think at the end of the day, even though I'm not a Republican myself, I think we need any democracy needs competition. I mean, one of the things the kind of bread and butter of a democracy is there's competition for power. Two parties competing for office, each with a viable chance of winning majorities. And I think we're in a situation today where the Republican Party is not able to win national majorities. Certainly, they're able to win majorities in certain states. I mean, there's no question about that. But it's given the diversity, the vastness of the United States geographically, in terms of its population, the Republican Party has real difficulty winning national majorities, both in terms of the presidency. I mean, it has only won the popular vote once since 1988. In terms of the Senate, it's rarely won popular majorities in these 6-year cycles in which the Senate's reconstituted. And the Republican kind of mindset controls the judiciary without having one. So the justices are often appointed by presidents who don't win majorities and confirmed by senates that don't represent majorities. So the party's not able to win majorities. At the end of the day, I think it would be great for American democracy if both parties could compete, because then they'd be fighting over real issues. Now, the path to that is by reaching out to more diverse voters. And most parties, when they lose elections, they regroup and they figure out a way to win, like a firm or a baseball team. You have a losing season, you come up with a new strategy. The Republican Party is not doing that. So I think to the degree to which it could reach out to all sorts of different voters, whether African Americans, Latinos, whatever, independent voters, moderate voters, that would actually ultimately be, I think, a healthy sign for American democracy. They can't do that right now because they have an agenda that is dominated by white grievance, by a kind of combined with a kind of libertarian, so far, this is their primary economic stance. Libertarian economic stance is not particularly popular. And so, you can have, in Florida, you have some Latino voters who are often immigrants or the children of immigrants from Latin American countries that have experienced really authoritarian left-wing governments, or some Latino voters in South Texas, which are primarily rural areas where one would expect Republicans to do well. The party's doing okay at the kind of margins, but I think there's a tendency for pollsters to kind of take short-term blips and to kind of read broad sweeping trends into these. And so until the evidence really shows that they can reach out to these voters, I don't take it too seriously. Again, that said, at some level, it may be a positive development if this were to happen. And so I think we have to think about ways of allowing both parties to compete to win majorities.
One of the interesting things I found about reading your book, it's a very interesting book, is the way in which you interpret race into everything. You talk about white grievance. If the majority of white people vote for the Republican Party, does that inevitably make it a racial party, an ethnographic party, in the same way perhaps as if the majority of African Americans vote for the Democrats? Does that make it a racial party? The logic is hard to figure out. I don't know how you feel about it. I wasn't sure what to make of your focus on ethnicity and the way in which, at least it seems in your and Steve's view, it defines these parties.
Yeah, I mean, the parties have, remain coalitions of different interests and groups. The Republican Party is certainly, pushed. I mean, one of the things that Trump did was, his one accomplishment, in this, if you want to call it that, is to reduce taxes massively and to appoint judges kind of who are going to be pro-business judges. I mean, so there is a strong pro-business side to the Republican coalition that represent. I mean, I'm not even sure if I call it pro-business, but certainly for people who have a lot of money, the Republican Party is doing their bidding. So I think that's undoubtedly a big part of the appeal of the party to certain segments. And so people are willing to overlook some of the other stuff because they're able to get tax cuts and so on. So, but I would say that race clearly plays an important role in American society. I wouldn't say that any party that wins a lot of white voters is necessarily a party of white racial grievance. I mean, through the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, both parties were overwhelmingly white parties, and race was not something they were often. The Republican Party wasn't a party of so overtly a party of white racial grievance. I think what's happened is, as American societies become more diverse, if you have to look at how they're appealing to voters, and if the appeal to voters is kind of caravans of immigrants coming across the border, which the Republican Party seems to trot out at every midterm election, sometimes with not very great success. But this is a kind of a sign of a party of white grievance, or a kind of anti-immigrant, which has great resonance with European political parties that take a similar kind of stance on immigration. So I think race is very much at the center of what the Republican Party is doing. It's not the only thing that the party is doing, but as long as the party kind of tries to make the case that it's a party protecting a kind of way of life that is under siege because of ethnic diversity, and I think gender plays a role in this as well. I mean, I wouldn't want to only talk about race. I mean, gender, transgender issues, these kinds of notion. I mean, the essential notion is that society is changing very rapidly, and we want to defend the status quo. So, to that degree, I think the party is a party at points a party of white racial grievance.
We are speaking with Daniel Ziblatt, the co-author of Tyranny of the Minority. He's an expert on European politics. I want to take a short break, and after the break, I want to talk about what America can and can't learn from European democracies and perhaps European authoritarian systems. Over the break, I want to thank the sponsor of this show, a wonderful new podcast, which has been started by a friend of mine. I think it launches today. It's called Disorder, and it's put on by Jason Pack. He's been on the show before, and it's also hosted by the British diplomat Alexandra Hall. The podcast drills down into the central dynamics of key global challenges that our listeners, keen on listeners, care about, like AI, climate change, the war in Ukraine, and populism, which we're talking with Daniel about today. The Disorder pod is unique in that it seems to present a unified theory of the key features of our global system via engaging storytelling and discussions with world-leading experts, senior diplomats, cultural icons, and opinion formers. A lot of them have actually been on Keen On, like Anne Applebaum, Brian Klass, Jonathan Powell. So I would strongly recommend that you subscribe to Jason's new show, Disorder, an essential listen if you want to make sense of our disordered but fascinating world. And now we're back with my guest today, Daniel Ziblatt, the author of Tyranny of the Minority. I'm sure that actually, Daniel, you'll end up on the Disorder show. I'm sure you know Jason. Let's focus on Europe. In my conversation, as I said, with your co-author Steve Levitsky, he talked to me about what an increasingly broken American political system has to learn from the democracies of Brazil and Argentina, which was quite striking, particularly on the constitutional or absence of the constitutional front. Your book focuses on the archaic nature of the American Constitution and why it threatens democracy. What do you think Americans can and can't learn from European political systems? And don't just talk about Denmark, Daniel. We don't want to hear any more about Denmark these days.
What about Norway? Is that
So I guess you can have Norway, but not Denmark.
Yeah. So look, I mean, this is really the heart of our book. I mean, we're talking about race and so on. I mean, these are important issues too. But I think the main message we really want to get out with our book is to think about the role of the Constitution in American history and in the current moment. And I have to begin by saying that I'm a great admirer of the U.S. Constitution. It was a remarkable document when it was written, in many ways a revolutionary document. And this is not just a caveat. I mean, this is really critical to understanding where we are. I mean, the threats that have come to democracies around the world, let's say in Hungary or even in Israel today, in some sense, our Constitution protects us from those because of divided power, checks and balances, our federal system, all of these, the kind of deconcentration of power is a great bulwark. And so I think that there's real virtue in that. That said, I mean, there are certain features of our Constitution which I think at the current moment are exacerbating the tensions at another level. And so that's what I kind of want to emphasize. I mean, so when faced off with a kind of anti-democratic force within a democracy, in the United States, of course, is not the only country to face this. I think the alternative for Germany, and Germany is one. Not every populist party in Europe is a threat to democracy. I mean, you may not like what they say about immigration, but many of them are. I mean, many of them are threats to democracy. I mean, I think certainly Viktor Orban's party has proven to be a threat to democracy in Hungary. So the question is, if you're in a democracy, how do you deal with this? And there's different ways of dealing with it. And I think European democracies have dealt with this in different ways than we have. And maybe before even getting to the Constitution, if I might just say two things that we can learn from European democracies is, that and really more in the short run. I mean, the one thing that a lot of European democracies are doing when faced off against anti-democratic forces is a kind of strategy of containment, where political parties of the center get together and keep out the anti-democratic extremists by forming grand coalitions that are often uncomfortable, that are often not particularly popular, but that do have the benefit of keeping these parties out of power, at least in the short run. And so that's something that I think we've actually seen signs of in the United States. It's much more difficult in the two-party system to do this. But if you think of the 2016, and especially the 2020 election, where you have kind of never Trump Republicans rallying to support Joe Biden, in a sense, this is the strategy of containment at work.
And is this, we did a show yesterday with Cenk Ugya. I'm sure you're familiar with his work. He's a left-wing Democrat. Justice is coming. I think there are people on the left, Daniel, who are very critical of that, because they would argue, I don't want to put words into Cenk's mouth, but he's got enough words of his own. But the idea that we have to become hysterical over Trump and essentially join together and lose any political identity, is there a downside to that?
Certainly there is. And so I think at best, it's a short-run strategy. I mean, what it does is but when fate, look, I mean, Germans in the early 1930s, there were some Germans who thought the same thing. The communists need to stand up for themselves. The social democrat, we can't work with the social democrats. We'll call them social fascists. And Hitler came to power in 1932. So, I mean, that's obviously, I'm not trying to draw a direct analogy to the United States, but the point is, under certain conditions, short-run coalitions may be necessary. The downside of it that I recognize is that it reduces political competition. I mean, the essence of democracy in large part is about political competition. If the main parties get together, this is kind of collusion. Would be as if, Samsung and Apple got together and to keep out the small cell phone companies, right? I mean, this is not promoting of competition, but for the short run, it may be a necessary strategy. But I don't think that this is the kind of way this is not a viable long run strategy. Similarly, there's another strategy and actually, just to say, I mean, from the European context, a country like Austria, where grand coalitions governed for decades, this exacerbated the problem because it reinforced the idea that populists are being excluded, and voters sort of felt like this is collusion. And so
I wonder if the same's happening in France also.
Yes, that's right. I think that's right. And so I mean, Macron's government, came into power. It's not not based on a real party. And people sort of out of desperation, one time it's fine, but if you do this election after election, it begins to create problems. You need to have viable competition, alternative views, and so on. So another strategy that's often used by European democracies is this strategy of militant democracy, where, again, this emerging after World War II, that especially in Germany, embedded in the Constitution is this ability of Ministry of Interior to open investigations of political parties that seem to be an attack on the Constitution or democracy. Court procedure is undertaken. Parties can be, investigated and ultimately even banned. This is also, something used against fascist parties in the 1950s, against communist parties. This is also something that is a very dangerous weapon because it can be easily abused. This certainly during the 1950s in the United States and the Red Scares. This is something that good actors can be targeted by political elites, and these instruments can be abused. But it is a tool that's available to European democracies, And, I think Americans have only now recently come to discover it's a tool that exists in the United States, much less well developed in the 14th Amendment, and this idea that Trump could be banned from running for office because of this section of the 14th Amendment that emerged after the Civil War that said insurrectionists can't hold federal office. And I tend to think that would actually be a mistake in the current setting in the U.S. because, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but my sense is that there's not enough of a kind of history of jurisprudence on this. Essentially we have this constitutional doctrine, and then secretaries of states are going to run with it. It's dangerous. So I think this is also potentially a mistaken strategy. So what is the way forward? I think the way forward, and I think European democracies also offer lessons here, is since 1945, European democracies have been made more democratic. Their constitutions were very much, you have indirect elected upper chambers. You had, systems where, the legislation was blocked through kind of equivalents of filibuster through the late 19th century. European democracies were not particularly democratic in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But over the course of the 20th century, in the particular post-war period, countries, hate to say it, like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Germany, did things like eliminated their upper chambers altogether, introduced proportional representation. If places had electoral colleges, abolished their electoral colleges. They, in places that kept upper chambers, like Germany, they made them more proportional to population. So bigger states had more representation than smaller states. All of these measures made these systems more democratic. And I think at the end of the day, made these democracies more vital and made them less vulnerable because they allow majorities to speak more forcefully, even in proportional systems. This makes it more difficult for authoritarian minority forces to take over a political system. The United States, we've stopped doing those kinds of institutional reforms roughly around 1970 with the failure of the Electoral College effort to abolish the Electoral College in 1970. And because of that
was Carter, wasn't it? I'm just reading about that in Nixon land.
Yeah, so the closest effort came in 1970 under Nixon. Nixon supported it. The Chamber of Commerce supported it. The AFL-CIO supported eliminating the Electoral College. The American Bar Association, according to opinion polls, 70% of Americans. So this was something that was very viable to eliminate this. Other democracies have done it. The world hasn't come to an end, and we didn't. And I think in a way we are now, if we had abolished that in 1970, it's very unlikely that Donald Trump would have become president in 2016.
Could America be Denmark, Daniel?
No, I don't think so. But there are things we can learn. I think we can learn. This is one of the things that we have this, America is exceptional in many ways. But at certain moments in our history, the beginning of the 20th century, we learned from other democracies to regulate our economies, to city planning. And we also, our universities, the university I teach at, Harvard University, was based on European university models of granting PhDs. And I think today we can learn from some of these institutional reforms. There's no cookie cutter thing that we adopt every institutional reform that's existed in any other democracy. America's much vaster in scale than Denmark. It's a federal system. So in many ways, there's things that don't fit the US, but there are certain institutional reforms that we can learn from these other democracies.
You mentioned, Daniel, Hungary and Italy. Orban is the pin-up, it seems, for some people on the right in America. Meloni was characterized as a neo-fascist, whatever that means, some association with Mussolini, but most of the media on her has been reasonably positive. Is it conceivable that Meloni is the future? A populist conservatism, anti-immigrant, but it doesn't necessarily or anti-immigration doesn't necessarily make it anti-democracy. Tell me your interpretation of what's happening in Italy and whether we can distinguish Meloni from Orban in terms of these different fashions on the right in Europe.
It is important, but also very difficult to distinguish. I spent a lot of my scholarly time trying to do this, to kind of figure out what are the differences between these far right parties, some of which are really anti-immigrant, but not as directly assaulting democratic norms. So in other words, if a party wants to limit immigrants at the border, that's maybe not something I would support personally. But if they accept election results and they don't use violence to try to gain and hold on to power, and they don't associate with groups that do that, then this is not as an overt a threat to democracy. And
It's
so,
not any threat, though,
yeah,
Daniel, is it? I mean, it's quite legitimate to simply say to argue that you that we don't believe that large-scale immigration into our country is a good thing.
yeah. I mean, I think this again, people may not like that as a position, but one can have policy views on these kinds of questions that are perfectly legitimate. What tends to be the case, though, is that many of the parties that do take this stance also associate with groups or don't overtly distance themselves from groups that do engage in violence. I mean, I think the AfD in Germany is a model of this, and so that's why it's quite tricky. But I think in principle it should be possible. The Swiss People's Party, which is a kind of far right party, I would say is not a threat to democracy. It's a party that's populist, that's demagogic, that is anti-immigrant, but it's not as clearly a threat to democracy as the AfD. So one can kind of make these fine distinctions, and I think it's important to, because as one tries to figure out how to deal with them, do you form a I don't think anybody's under any obligation to form a coalition with anybody, but if you're a center-right party, like let's say in Germany, should you form a coalition with the AfD? I would say that's very dangerous. In Sweden, the Swedish center-right has formed a coalition with the far right in Sweden, and so I think in some sense it's there's a lot of debate now. Is this is this a threat to democracy or not? And I think the Italian situation is quite similar in the sense that you have a coalition government. Meloni is part of this broader coalition, so she doesn't have single-handed power. That's a big contrast with Hungary. And she seems, while in power, at least so far, to not be directly assaulting democratic institutions. Now, Viktor Orban is somebody who's very different, who in some ways is the reverse, because he came in, with a kind of liberal background, having been, an opponent of the communist regime and had studied at Oxford, supported by George Soros, and had a kind of reputation of being he had drifted to the right over the course of the 1990s, sort of styled himself as a Christian Democrat. But so the alarm bells didn't really go off before he got into power. But once in power, he's engaged in acts which I think do violate democratic norms and principles. He hasn't tried to steal an election. He hasn't called out the troops on his opposition, but he has rigged the game. Made it, just to give some very concrete examples, redrawn the election districts to make it so hard for the opposition to win that it kind of entrenches himself in power. Now, all politicians do that, but in most political systems, both parties do it. And so they kind of counterbalance each other. Viktor Orban had such a large majority that he was able to do this single-handedly, so it was harder to vote him out of power. He revamped the court system to make sure his party was in charge of it. He's put real pressure on the media to, put pressure on the private media to kind of, so that media has been sold to more friendly audiences. So he's done things legally. I mean, I really want to emphasize he's done things legally, but in a way that at the end of the day has hampered political competition. If you have unfair political competition, this is a problem for democracy. And so that's why I think he has been the kind of poster child for the American anti-democratic right, as well as somebody who I think we should recognize is a problem for democracy.
He calls himself an illiberal Democrat. I mean, it's obviously somewhat of a provocation to people like yourself. Can one be an illiberal Democrat?
Yeah, that's a debate that lots of people, political philosophers engage in. I don't think so. I mean, given our current definition of democracy, the kind of modern conception of democracy that I think I subscribe to, democracy to my mind consists of three big pillars. Number one, you have an inclusive polity in which as many adults can participate as possible. You don't restrict the right to vote and participation to any adults. That's one pillar. The second pillar is you have fair competition. One party can't just kind of monopolize power. There's genuine competition where on election night, the incumbent has to be a little worried that they might lose. And then the third pillar is the pillar of civil liberties. You need to have civil liberties, freedom of press, freedom of association. These are the liberal values that underpin a democracy. So if you cut that pillar out and say you're an illiberal democracy, I think you're losing an essential feature of democracy. Now, I think what he means by this is less that third pillar. He means, liberal cultural. He doesn't embrace liberal cultural values, which, you might say, well, you could be a kind of populist and not think certain, be against, immigration and so on. But, if that very quickly bleeds into, however, restrictions on rights of individuals based strictly on their background. I'm a classical liberal in that I think, all citizens should have equal rights. whatever their background. And so if he, by being an illiberal, that to me, I think is a liberal. If he doesn't think
Even Republicans?
yes, even Republicans. So anybody who's following the law, who, if you break the law, that doesn't mean you have a right not to go to jail. If you attempt a coup, this doesn't mean you have a right to not be prosecuted for that. So, if you break the law, you obviously don't deserve rights, but anybody who's following the law deserves equal rights, equal rights under the law. So that's what to me to be a liberal is, and I think the concern is that to proudly proclaim you're an illiberal Democrat, as you say, is a provocation, but also suggests a problem for democracy.
Your book is called Tyranny of the Minority. One thing that unites left and right media these days is hostility and concern over old politicians, whether it's Pelosi or Feinstein or McConnell or Biden or Trump. They all seem to be enormously old. Your book doesn't talk about the tyranny of a gerontocracy. Are you concerned with that too?
Well, in one way we do, actually. I mean, it's an interesting issue, and I think it's becoming more of an issue. And partly with technology and so on, people can live longer. That's part of the issue, but there's something else going on that I don't think people have really firmly kind of understood. Why is this happening, especially in the United States? This, as a comparativist, I can kind of see across countries. This is a distinctive problem in the U.S., maybe in other democracies. I haven't really studied this, but one area where we do in our book talk about this issue less directly is in the court system. I mean, the court system, we don't have term limits or retirement ages. And this is even more of a problem in the court system in a sense, because at least Nancy Pelosi has to run every 2 years, right? So she's accountable to the voters, even though she has clearly like huge incumbency advantages and so on. She has to put herself up, Dianne Feinstein, she's not running again. And if she were to run again, she would lose. So
she can't run. I don't think she can even walk these days, can she?
So, I mean, so there are built-in mechanisms of constraint in elections. When it comes to judges, we are the only democracy, we make the case in our book, we're the only democracy in the world, I mean, this is borne out by the evidence, in which you have neither term limits nor retirement ages for national judges. Now, other democracies used to not have retirement ages and term limits. Every other democracy introduced these. We have not for our federal judges. We have this for state judges, and so this is a kind of distinctive thing about our national judiciary, federal judiciary. And this is a problem with regards to age for the following reason. If somebody's appointed a generation ago, 30, 40 years later, they're still in office, there's no mechanism of accountability. I mean, the link to the majority that selected them is 30 years old. And so the idea that they'll be more and more out of sync the longer that people live with majority preferences is a real threat and a real problem. And I think it, in large part, explains the declining legitimacy of the U.S. Supreme Court today. That there's a sense in which the judges themselves don't, judges shouldn't be beholden to majorities. That's certainly the case. But on the other hand, they shouldn't be so out of sync with majorities that they're making decisions that really run totally counter to what most people think. And so I think there is that risk in our current system. And so I think other democracies have found a solution to this, and that is by imposing term limits, which would also, by the way, have the effect of reducing the kind of turmoil over each Supreme Court nomination, where there's this gamesmanship, where each president thinks they can, they want to, nominate somebody while they're in office. The opposition thinks, well, if we can block it, we can hold this over till the next term. I mean, this is what happened with Merrick Garland and the effort by Obama to appoint him, that the Republicans blocked this in the Senate, and this will be tempting to engage in on both sides. The way you avoid this altogether is by having term limits. And so each president gets to appoint 2 judges per term.
Yeah. And it works both ways. I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of course, should have resigned. Let's end, Daniel. Wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. Let's end with a return where we started with ethnocracy in America. You focus on it in the book. I think you acknowledge it's a reality. If America can reinvent its politics, if it can get beyond its constitution or change its constitution, modernize its constitution, can America also get beyond the politics of ethnicity? Could we get to a point in the middle of the 21st century where we're not obsessed with race and defining each party, whether they're white or black or brown, Or if we get what you want, which is constitutional reform, which I think probably will eventually happen, could America get locked in an increasingly dangerous spiral of ethnic politics?
No, I think the constitutional reforms is the solution to this issue. I mean, that we want to have two parties that can reach out to majorities. In order to have two parties to reach out to majorities, by definition, they can't rely on a kind of racialized base. And as that happens, if parties are competing over ideas rather than race, then race becomes less important. I mean, of course, people have their cultural backgrounds that they embrace and in their private lives and so on. But our politics doesn't need to, if we can kind of guarantee political equality of all individuals, independent of race and ethnicity, then race and ethnicity becomes less of a salient feature of our national politics. And I think ultimately, that has to be the hope.